Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and I'll be your guide. Well, folks, hope you're having a fantastic day and an even better week. Folks, in this video, we're going to jump in and we're going to talk a little bit about, are we just doing things to fill the gaps? Now, you might be thinking, maybe that you're not sure about that one, right? Well, this topic is much a personal existential discussion as it is talking about culture and the organizations that we typically form up in to work together as teams to accomplish a goal for customers. This is generally where we start out. But as we know, all dots connect personally, professionally, within culture, all the groups we're associated, friend groups, family groups, faith groups, all the groups, right? Everything connects. So use this information in a positive and hopefully it will help improve and maybe improve how well your life thrives and as well as the lives of those that you interact with on a daily basis, team members, leaders, all of it, right? Everyone in culture. So use what you will. That said, are we just doing things to fill the gaps? Now, I will admit this is another one of those, it should be a volume series, right? Because this could be broken down into so many aspects. But generally speaking, we're just going to kind of wander through the woods of this topic a little bit. Let's just relax and not get too overly structured. And let's just kind of see where we end up. And hopefully we'll come out on the other side and there'll be a really cool waterfall to check out. We can always hope, right? So are we just doing stuff to fill the gaps? If you think about it, folks, all of us, right? Right now, as I'm filming this video, it is approximately 8 p.m. In the evening in the summertime. There are fires in the region. The outside of this, the shop is just about surrounded by red smoke. I mean, it is awful, okay? But it's evening time, right? And it doesn't matter who we're talking about, all of us, right? We all are living in the conditions that we're living in, but we can what? There can be gaps. Now, sometimes those gaps can be fruitful ones, right? For us to rest and recharge. It could be argued I should be doing that right now, right? Or are we just doing stuff to fill the gaps? Right? No, not really, because as I thought about this, it kind of became a bit of a reflecting pool situation here. And I thought, well, this is actually probably a good topic because it can pull us in many different directions. Filling the gaps can be, we can fill it with some healthy things like recharging, right? Resting, maybe a little recreation. You might watch a movie or a show or whatever, surf the web a little bit, whatever you're doing there. Maybe you're working on your own crafts or projects and that sort of thing, right? There can be things that we fill the gaps of the requirements of our life with, right? But are we just beyond that? Do we find ourselves doing stuff? Now, there can also be constructive things like that. Like you can see that this shop's pretty clean. I mean, a year ago, this was a disgusting soup. But over the course of a year, I've been able to clean it up. I mean, you could just about eat off these floors. So we have to ask ourselves, are we just doing stuff in the gap? Now, sometimes we do need to switch up what we're doing, right? Work, other requirements. We have to eat, do the laundry, all the things the must-dos, right? But in the in-between, we can then overpopulate that time with things that may seem constructive, may not be so constructive, right? Some of the criticisms can be about video games, right? A lot of people will kind of dog out the whole video game culture. And yeah, there's obviously anything to excess is not going to be good, right? A good example of filling the gaps with stuff, right? It can also be a bit of a recharge. It can be a little bit of an escape to recharge, right? Just kind of give you a little bit of a dopamine hit. And we're not against dopamine hits, as long as they're healthy dopamine hits and they're not to such a degree that we're addicted to things, right? that's when other aspects of our lives get hurt by what we fill those gaps with. But now back to what we fill those gaps with, whether they're healthy or whether they're unhealthy, hopefully not, but irrespective, we have to ask ourselves, are we doing it? And this is the existential portion of this. Are we filling the gaps with stuff to avoid doing and or addressing other things, right? So if it's, well, I'm going to, you're a person that hates laundry. I used to hate laundry. I made friends with all my chores now. But say you're a person who hates to do the laundry. Well, you'll avoid the laundry by filling the gap of time where you probably should be doing laundry, especially if you're in a team scenario with a significant other and all the things. But you will find opportunities to do other things. Maybe you'd rather mow the yard, right? Even, and vice versa. Maybe you're a person, I don't want to do yard work. I'd rather do the laundry, right? And we're human. These are the little isms that can follow us around. And I use these benign. These aren't going to hurt us, right? But these are examples of where we would avoid one thing to gravitate to another, right? Because maybe it's safe, or I don't want to deal with the yard. Maybe the yard's 3 feet high and weeds all around, right? Maybe it's a jungle. But when we're filling the gaps with stuff, right? We have to ask ourselves, are we doing that to avoid addressing other things? Are we doing things, are we spending 2 hours to set up for a family meal and being so intricate about, all the things to avoid having important family conversations, right? Are we filling the gaps with things that help us to avoid critical things, especially relationships, right, folks? Because relationships are the building block of everything that we have going on, right? It's one of the, I would say one of the molecular structure of culture, right? Is that our relationships be as healthy as possible. Sometimes, and this is where it gets a little scary, people will fill the gaps with controversy, which, drama and toxicity, we know these words, right? In our modern age, I guess. But they will fill the gaps with those unhealthy things, rumor, control, and all the, all the things that aren't going to be helpful. To such an extent that people will deride other people, right, as a distraction from dealing with their yard or their laundry or their this or their that or their own, right, issues that they have going on, right? So diving into others' problems, right, being overly, I guess you could say, overly invested in other people's drama and so forth, and neglecting, your own, let's say your own pile, right? It could be a situation where people are doing this and they're neglecting their family because they're spending too much time in somebody else's issues. So are we investing? Are we filling the gaps, right, to avoid other things, right? We're just doing stuff to fill the gap. Could be, but are we filling stuff to fill, just doing stuff to fill the gap that allows us to avoid dealing with certain things? It might be you need to sit down and have a critical conversation with your teenagers, your kids, or whatever, but you keep kind of pushing it off. Instead, you keep filling, your bucket with, well, I've got to do the yard work and I've got to paint the back fence. The back fence hasn't been touched in 25 years. It's just filling the gaps now with all the things that I'd rather do to avoid not doing what I'm apprehensive about addressing, right? Maybe, and we know this because we've talked about it before, that underlying reason for avoiding anything is fear, right? In fact, a big portion of this is because we have to deal with ourselves, right? We'd much rather, in a scenario where a person would want to clean up a shop to avoid dealing with their own shadow, right? Dealing with their own stuff. And you might see where these same folks will go on to volunteer to clean up other people's shops and or property and or. Now, maybe a skill, maybe a livelihood, but maybe they're avoiding having those tough conversations and or meaningful conversations. Not everything meaningful is tough and vice versa, right? Sometimes that meaningful, important conversation, yes, it does carry it. There is a bit of a fear there. There is a fear of vulnerability that comes from that because now somebody, you may not, you may trip over your words and maybe you're concerned that somebody's not going to understand what you're thinking because the words don't come out in exactly the same way, right? And so you may be fearful of this. Well, I'd like to have this conversation, but I'm afraid I'm going to screw it up because I'm going to say things all backwards, right? And it's going to be taken wrong and be misunderstanding. You're afraid of a future that hasn't happened yet. I guess the best advice there, if I'm to lend any advice, is small potatoes. Don't try to have a smorgasbord of topics, right? Pick one or two, one preferably, but one or two smaller inroads and then just work on those, baby steps, right? If you're uncomfortable or you're struggling in that area, then just start. For some folks, sometimes writing things out, just kind of getting some things out of your head onto paper. Some people, maybe you talk to yourself. I don't know, whatever. I guess you could say until this is watched, I'm essentially talking to myself, kind of, sort of, right? In a weird way. But I'm also talking to everybody else that may see this, right? It's for the future, right? Whatever the future might be, a second from now, a minute from now, or a day or a year from now. You may stumble across this 10 years from now and it's, you've found an old iPhone buried in the desert and you pick it up or whether it be an iPhone or just a computer and it happens to be it was stuck on this particular video and you hit the play button and boom, you're like, wow, time capsule, right? I'm just, little left turn there in our topic, but you got to have some fun too, right? And that's the other part of this as well. Fill in the gaps with fun. Absolutely. We've got to have some distractions. We've got to have some distractions to recharge and to distract ourselves so we're not, inundated in the super serious all the time so that we don't forget that life should be enjoyed, right? But we can also go too far, right? And we can we'll fill those gaps and then we may be neglecting other aspects of life, right? And we also have to remember, folks, not everybody's dealing with the same life. If you're a leader of a big organization and you got a home or two and pools in the backyard and multiple acres and you got all the things, you got a lot of little dopamine hits all around your life. There's a lot of folks on your teams that are living a little bit more black and white. They may be living in an apartment complex or something like that, right? And maybe their distraction is to watch a show or to play a video game or to go for a walk the dog. And not they've got, 2 to 4 things that they can do that they can afford to do. Really, that's different, right? Besides just reading a book and so on. But especially if they're not, if they're not really into creative things or looking for creative things, they can become pretty bored. And what do you think is going to fill their gaps now? Could be potentially harmful or toxic things, right? Isn't to say it can't happen to anybody, but keeping all this in mind, are we just doing stuff to fill the gaps? Is it possible that we should be looking at filling more of those gaps with meaningful things, right? And maybe you're doing a craft or creating a thing for somebody you care about, for a relative, for a friend, for XYZ, your church, your community, whatever. Are you doing things to, right, add to the tapestry of the flavor of life? There's a bit of a dopamine hit there because you feel good to do good things, right? So this is a little bit of a, look in the mirror, but it's mostly to say, are we just doing stuff to avoid, right, addressing other things and dealing with other aspects of our own life or others in our own life, right? Or mending fences and building bridges, that maybe were once destroyed in relationships and so forth and so on, right? Maybe it's just calling up that old friend and saying, hey, how you doing? I hope everything's good. Whatever it might be, it's reaching out. It is connecting. And then just listen to the winds of your intuition or your heart, or or the grand watchmaker, and then follow that. And where does that lead you? So don't overly obsess over thinking, oh my gosh, there's some gaps. I don't want to just fill them. No, it's okay. Sometimes, and let's ease off it a little bit. Sometimes filling those gaps, if you're anything like I am, it helps me to think. I could actually mow a whole yard and think about a million things. It's kind of like driving. It's not really that crazy a focus that you have to do it. You can do two things at once, right? And if you've ever done that, where you've gone on a trip and your mind wandered while you're driving, next thing you know, 3 or 4 hours goes by and you thought about all kinds of interesting things, resolved all kinds of issues globally and everything else. And you were driving the whole time, and maybe you don't even remember the last 4 turns that you made, to get where you're going. So sometimes filling that gap can help you mentally recount, recycle, and readdress and or think about some of the important things too, right? So if you can walk and chew gum at the same time in that way, then that's constructive. That's actually a good thing. If you can fill, then you're not just filling, you're not just doing stuff to fill the gaps. If you're consciously just doing stuff to avoid other things, that's the thing we got to be careful about, because things are just going to mount up. And next thing you know, you're going to be doing all these things to distract yourself and never having, alleviated. You might find, once you dealt with the tough, meaningful conversations and addressing different aspects of life, once you've addressed those things and dealt with them, you can check them off the box. And now you move on and you're just a little bit lighter. You don't have that fear. You don't have that weight on your shoulders anymore. And that hopefully will come back to you in good health and better sleep and all the good things, right? So just to talk a little bit about filling the gaps in our lives with stuff. Let's just not fill it with stuff. Let's make sure that there's purpose in everything we do, even if the purpose is just to have fun and make a game of it. So, well, that's going to be it for today, folks. Hope you're having a fantastic day. Remember, hit that good green domino 3 to 5 times a day or more to uplift, motivate, inspire, and just encourage one another. When you do this, not only helping to transform culture, but you're transforming your own life. But don't forget, we can't transform anything on the outside if we're not first willing to transform on the inside. This is so important. All right, folks, have a fantastic day. Hit like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.